the coastal town of Seabrook, Maine, was known for its quaint charm and misty mornings. Wooden houses with weathered shutters lined the streets, and the rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore was a constant melody. At the edge of this quiet town, a small cottage stood just a stone's throw from the beach. In this cottage lived Annie, a beautiful border collie with a sleek black and white coat, and her 4 playful puppies. Among them was Max, the most curious of the bunch, while his siblings enjoyed curling up in the safety of their mother's warmth. Max was always eager to explore the open stretch of sand. The glint of seashells and the distant cries of seagulls seemed to call out to him every day. On a breezy autumn afternoon, the sun peeked through a layer of soft gray clouds, casting a golden glow over the shore. Annie lay comfortably on the porch, her watchful eyes scanning her puppies as they played. Max, as always, was at the forefront, chasing a butterfly that fluttered teasingly just beyond his reach. "Stay close, Max," Annie barked gently, her voice carrying both affection and authority. But Max, caught up in the thrill of the chase, barely noticed. His tiny paws kicked up little clouds of sand as he darted after the butterfly. The creature led him farther and farther down the beach, past the familiar rocks and driftwood that marked the boundary of his usual play area. Annie noticed his growing distance and stood up. Her ears perked. She barked louder this time. "Max, come back!" Max paused for a moment, his ears twitching at his mother's voice. But just then, a flock of seagulls swooped low over the waves, their raucous cries stirring his curiosity. He forgot all about his mother's warning and ran after them instead, his little tail wagging furiously. The wind began to pick up, rustling the dune grass and sending a chill through the air. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, hinting at an approaching storm. Annie's instincts kicked in. She barked sharply, calling all her puppies to her side. 3 of them obediently scampered back, but Max was nowhere in sight. Panic began to creep into Annie's chest. She raced down the beach, her nose low to the ground, searching for Max's scent. The wind grew stronger, and the once gentle waves turned into frothy, churning breakers. Meanwhile, Max had followed the seagulls to the edge of the water, where they hopped and squawked among the foam. He pounced at them playfully, but a sudden gust of wind sent a powerful wave crashing onto the shore. The water surged around Max's tiny legs, pulling him off balance. He yelped, trying to scramble back to the safety of the sand. But the tide was too strong. In an instant, another wave rolled in, sweeping Max off his feet and into the cold embrace of the ocean. Annie reached the shoreline just in time to see her puppy's small black and white form being carried away by the current. Her heart sank as she barked frantically, running along the water's edge. But no matter how fast she ran, the waves pulled Max farther and farther away. "Max!" Annie's desperate cries were drowned out by the roaring wind and crashing waves. The storm intensified, and soon, Max was nothing more than a tiny speck on the vast, restless sea. Annie stood frozen on the shore, her chest heaving as the rain began to fall. That night, as the storm raged on, Annie lay curled on the porch of the cottage. Her other puppies huddled close to her, but her gaze never left the horizon, where her little Max had disappeared into the unknown. Far out at sea, Max clung to a piece of driftwood, shivering and soaked to the bone. His tiny body trembled with fear and cold, but his spirit, fueled by a flicker of hope, refused to give up. The sun rose sluggishly the next morning, its light pale and muted behind layers of gray clouds. The sea had calmed, but the vast expanse of water stretched endlessly in every direction. Max clung tightly to the piece of driftwood that had become his lifeline. His paws were numb from the cold, and his small body trembled with exhaustion. Every so often, a weak whimper escaped his lips. The salt water had soaked his fur, making it heavy and clinging to his thin frame. His throat burned from thirst, and his stomach growled painfully. The playful pup who had once bounded across the sandy shores was now reduced to a desperate survivor, floating alone on the open sea. As the morning stretched on, Max's senses grew dull. He stared blankly at the water around him, barely noticing the occasional splash of fish or the distant cries of gulls overhead. But then, a small, unfamiliar sensation began to prickle at his sides. First, it was barely noticeable, a slight itch on his legs and under his belly. By midday, the itch had turned into a sharp sting. Max looked down and saw tiny, grayish shapes clinging to his fur. Barnacles. They had begun to attach themselves to his body, taking advantage of his long hours in the water. First, Max tried to ignore them, but the discomfort became unbearable. He twisted and turned on the driftwood, trying to reach the barnacles with his teeth. He managed to pull a few off, but their sharp edges left small, bleeding cuts on his skin. The barnacles weren't the only problem. The sun, though weak, began to burn against his wet fur, adding to his misery. His tiny paws, which had been gripping the driftwood for hours, ached as though they might give out at any moment. By evening, Max was weak, hungry, and in pain. The barnacles had multiplied, clinging stubbornly to his legs and sides. His movements grew slower, weighed down by exhaustion and the added burden of the barnacles. Every small wave that rocked his driftwood sent a jolt of pain through his tender skin. In his mind, Max thought of home. He pictured the warm porch of the cottage, the comforting smell of his mother, Annie, and the sound of his siblings' playful yips. These memories were a lifeline of their own, keeping him going even as his body screamed for rest. But the ocean was relentless. That night, another storm rolled in, not as fierce as the first, but enough to send waves crashing against Max's fragile refuge. The driftwood tilted dangerously, threatening to overturn. Max clung on with the last of his strength, his claws digging into the wood as he whimpered into the howling wind. The barnacles cut deeper into his skin, and the salty spray of the waves stung his wounds. His breathing grew ragged, each gasp of air a struggle against the weight of his exhaustion. Finally, as the storm passed and the waves began to calm, Max's body slumped against the driftwood. His eyes fluttered shut, and for the first time, a flicker of despair crept into his heart. But even in the darkness of his fading consciousness, the spark of hope remained. Max didn't know how or when, but somewhere deep inside, he believed that someone or something would come to his rescue. Far above, the stars began to pierce through the dissipating storm clouds, their faint light shimmering on the water. Max's little body floated onward, a tiny speck in the vast, indifferent sea, clinging to hope in the face of impossible odds. The sun broke over the horizon, casting a faint golden glow across the endless waves. Max was still floating on his piece of driftwood, his small body curled into a tight ball. The barnacles on his legs and belly had grown larger overnight, their sharp edges biting deeper into his skin. His fur, once sleek and shiny, was now matted with salt and grime, and his once bright eyes were dull with exhaustion. As the morning wore on, Max stirred weakly. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and every movement sent a sharp sting through his body. He tried to lift his head, but the weight of fatigue and pain made it almost impossible. The barnacles had become a constant torment, their hard shells cutting into his tender skin with every shift of the driftwood. Max whimpered softly, his voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the ocean. He looked around, hoping for some sign of land or another living creature. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of blue water stretching out in every direction. A sudden splash caught his attention. Max's ears perked up slightly, though they drooped from weariness. He turned his head slowly and saw a school of small silver fish darting beneath the driftwood. Their movements were quick and graceful, a blur of shimmering light beneath the surface. For a moment, Max felt a spark of hope. He instinctively reached out a paw, trying to swipe at the fish, but his movements were too slow. The fish scattered, leaving him empty-pawed. His stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder of how long it had been since he last ate. Desperation began to creep in. Max tried again, this time leaning over the edge of the driftwood to snap at the water with his jaws. But his efforts were futile. The fish were too quick, and Max was too weak. In his frustration, he shifted his weight too far to one side, causing the driftwood to tip dangerously. Max yelped as he slid off, plunging into the icy water. The sudden cold shocked his system, and he thrashed wildly, trying to climb back onto the driftwood. But the barnacles on his body made every movement painful. Their sharp edges dug into his skin, and Max let out a small cry as the salt water stung his open wounds. He clawed desperately at the driftwood, his tiny paws slipping on its slick surface. Finally, with a great effort, he managed to pull himself back up, collapsing in a shivering heap. Max lay there for a long time, his sides heaving as he caught his breath. His body was trembling, both from the cold and from the effort it had taken to climb back onto the driftwood. He looked down at his legs and saw that the barnacles had spread even further, their jagged shells cutting into his skin with every movement. The ocean seemed to mock him, its waves gently rocking the driftwood as if to lull him into submission. Max closed his eyes, feeling the weight of despair pressing down on him. He thought of his mother, Annie, and the warmth of her fur as she licked him clean after a long day of play. He thought of his siblings, their playful barks filling the air as they chased each other around the yard. "I want to go home," Max thought weakly, his heart aching with longing. But home felt impossibly far away. The day dragged on, and Max's strength continued to wane. He barely noticed the sun as it climbed higher into the sky, its rays now harsh and unrelenting. The heat burned against his wet fur, and Max's tongue lolled out of his mouth as he panted heavily. By the time evening approached, Max was on the verge of giving up. His vision blurred, and his breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps. The barnacles felt like chains, weighing him down and sapping what little energy he had left. Just as the last light of day began to fade, Max heard something, a faint, distant sound that made his ears perk up ever so slightly. It was low and rhythmic, unlike the natural sounds of the ocean. Max forced his eyes open, squinting into the distance. First, he saw nothing but the endless horizon. But then, a small shape appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a boat. Max's heart leapt with a mix of hope and disbelief. He tried to lift his head, but his body refused to cooperate. With the last bit of strength he could muster, Max let out a weak, broken bark. The boat continued to approach, its engine humming steadily. Max's eyes fluttered shut, his body too weak to hold on much longer. But deep in his heart, a flicker of hope remained. Help was coming. The low hum of the boat's engine grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the evening sea. On board, Keanu Reeves, a seasoned explorer and documentarian, stood at the helm. His sharp eyes scanned the water for any signs of life. Keanu had spent the past few weeks navigating the coastal waters of Maine, filming for his latest project on ocean conservation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, something unusual caught his attention, a small, dark shape floating amidst the gentle waves. "What's that?" Keanu muttered to himself, leaning forward to get a better look. He adjusted the throttle, slowing the boat as he steered toward the object. As he drew closer, Keanu's heart sank. It wasn't just a piece of debris or driftwood. It was a dog. "Good God," he whispered, quickly cutting the engine. He grabbed a rope and a blanket, moving with purpose as he approached the edge of the boat. The dog was barely moving, its small body curled tightly on a piece of driftwood. From the state of its matted fur and the barnacles clinging to its skin, it was clear the poor animal had been adrift for days. Keanu knelt down and called out gently, "Hey there, buddy. Hang on. I've got you." The sound of his voice stirred something in Max. His ears twitched faintly, and his eyes flickered open for a brief moment. He was too weak to move or bark, but the faint presence of another living being brought a flicker of hope back to his heart. Keanu acted quickly but carefully. He reached out with the rope, looping it under the piece of driftwood to secure it. Then, using all his strength, he pulled the dog and the driftwood closer to the boat. "Almost there, little guy," Keanu murmured, his voice calm and reassuring. When the driftwood was close enough, he reached down and scooped Max into his arms. The dog was lighter than he expected, his frail body shivering uncontrollably. Keanu's chest tightened as he felt the rough edges of barnacles digging into the dog's skin. Blood oozed from several small cuts, and the smell of salt and decay lingered on its fur. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Keanu said softly, cradling Max as he carried him inside the boat's cabin. Once inside, Keanu laid Max on a blanket and went to work. He grabbed a small medical kit from his supplies and began cleaning the dog's wounds. The barnacles were the first thing he addressed, carefully prying them off one by one. Each removal left a raw, bleeding spot, but Keanu worked with gentle precision, murmuring soothing words all the while. "It's okay, you're safe now," he said, his voice steady. Max whimpered softly, his body twitching in pain as each barnacle was removed. But even in his weakened state, he seemed to understand that this stranger was trying to help. He didn't struggle or resist, instead lying still as Keanu worked. After the last barnacle was removed, Keanu washed Max's wounds with fresh water, then applied an antiseptic to prevent infection. He wrapped the dog in a dry towel, leaving only its nose and eyes visible. "There we go," Keanu said, giving Max a small smile. "All patched up. You're a tough little guy, aren't you?" Max blinked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. For the first time in days, his small body relaxed, sinking into the warmth of the blanket. Keanu reached for a bottle of water and a small bowl, pouring a bit of water into it. He held it close to Max's nose, encouraging him to drink. First, Max hesitated, his parched tongue licking tentatively at the liquid. But soon, he began to lap it up eagerly, his body desperate for hydration. "That's it. Drink up," Keanu said, his smile widening. As the boat rocked gently on the calm waves, Keanu couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for the little survivor. He had seen his fair share of challenges and hardships during his travels, but this dog's resilience struck a chord in him. "You need a name," Keanu said thoughtfully, stroking Max's damp fur. "How about Storm? You look like you've been through one heck of a storm, and you're still standing or lying. At least." Max's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his new name. Keanu chuckled softly, taking it as a sign of approval. As night fell, the stars began to twinkle above, casting their light over the vast ocean. Keanu sat beside Storm, keeping a watchful eye on the little dog as he drifted into a deep, much-needed sleep. "You're safe now, Storm," Keanu said quietly, leaning back against the cabin wall. "I promise, I'll get you home." The morning sun filtered through the small cabin windows, casting a soft glow over Storm as he stirred beneath the blanket. His body, though still frail, felt lighter than it had in days. The barnacles that had tormented him were gone, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt a semblance of relief. Keanu sat nearby, sipping a cup of coffee and watching over Storm with quiet determination. He had anchored the boat in a calm cove overnight, giving both himself and his new companion a chance to rest. When he noticed Storm's eyes flutter open, a warm smile crossed his face. "Good morning, Storm," Keanu said, setting his cup down. "How are you feeling, buddy?" Storm blinked at him, his tail giving the faintest of wags under the blanket. Keanu chuckled and reached out to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Looks like you're a fighter," Keanu said. "Let's see if we can get you to eat something." He stood and rummaged through a small cooler, pulling out a piece of grilled chicken he'd saved from his dinner the night before. He shredded it into small pieces and placed them in a bowl, setting it down in front of Storm. Storm sniffed at the chicken cautiously, his nose twitching. The smell was irresistible, and soon he began to eat, taking small, careful bites. Keanu watched with satisfaction, feeling a sense of accomplishment as Storm finished the entire bowl. "That's my boy," Keanu said, gently patting Storm's head. "We'll have you back to full strength in no time." Over the next few days, Keanu dedicated himself to Storm's recovery. He carefully cleaned and rebandaged the dog's wounds each morning, making sure to keep them free of infection. He fed Storm small, nutritious meals to rebuild his strength and made sure he had plenty of fresh water. As the days passed, Storm's energy slowly returned. His once dull eyes regained their brightness, and his tail began to wag more frequently. Though his body was still marked by the scars of his ordeal, his spirit seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. One afternoon, as the boat gently rocked on the water, Keanu sat on the deck with a notebook in hand, jotting down observations for his project. Storm lay beside him, his head resting on Keanu's leg. "You know, Storm," Keanu said, glancing down at the dog, "I've seen a lot of things in my travels, storms, shipwrecks, even a few close calls of my own. But you're something else. You've got a will to live that most people could only dream of." Storm looked up at him, his amber eyes full of quiet understanding. Keanu sighed, setting the notebook aside. "But I bet you miss your family." "Huh? Your mom, your brothers and sisters. You must be wondering if they're still out there, looking for you." At the mention of his family, Storm's ears perked up. He sat up slowly, his gaze fixed on Keanu as if urging him to do something. Keanu nodded. "All right, I get it. We'll find them, I promise." The next morning, Keanu docked the boat in a small seaside town. He carried Storm in his arms as he walked along the marina, drawing curious looks from passers-by. The dog's scars and bandages told a story of survival, and people couldn't help but admire the bond between the man and the dog. Keanu found a small cafe with outdoor seating and sat down at a table. He pulled out his phone and began searching online for lost dog notices and local shelters. He also posted a photo of Storm on his social media, describing the dog's incredible journey and asking for information about his possible family. The post quickly gained attention. Within hours, comments and messages began pouring in from people touched by Storm's story. Some offered tips about lost dogs in the area, while others simply shared their admiration for the little survivor. That evening, as Keanu scrolled through the responses, one comment caught his eye. "I think I've seen this dog before." It read, "There's a border collie who's been wandering the beaches near Seabrook for days, barking and looking out at the water. Could it be his mother?" Keanu's heart raced. He looked down at Storm, who was curled up at his feet, and smiled. "We've got a lead, Storm," he said. "Looks like we're heading back to Seabrook." Storm wagged his tail, as if understanding that the journey to find his family was finally underway. The sun was just beginning to rise as Keanu steered his truck down the winding coastal road towards Seabrook. Storm sat beside him on the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the window, sniffing the cool morning air. His energy had returned noticeably over the past few days, and the once timid survivor now held his head high, his tail wagging at the slightest sign of excitement. "You feel that, Storm?" Keanu said, glancing at the dog. "We're getting closer. I can feel it too." Storm let out a soft bark, his ears twitching as the salty breeze drifted through the open window. The two had formed an unbreakable bond over the course of their journey. But Keanu knew deep down that Storm's heart still longed for his family. When they arrived in Seabrook, Keanu parked near the town's main pier. The area was already bustling with fishermen preparing their boats and early risers walking their dogs along the beach. Storm jumped out of the truck eagerly, his paws landing on the sandy ground with purpose. Keanu grabbed his backpack, stuffed with supplies and a few photos of Storm that he planned to show around. "All right, buddy, let's see if we can find your mom." They started at the marina, where Keanu showed Storm's photo to the locals. Many recognized the little dog from Keanu's online post and offered words of encouragement, but none had seen a border collie matching Storm's description recently. Storm, however, seemed to have his own instincts guiding him. He tugged gently at the leash, pulling Keanu toward the beach. Keanu followed without hesitation, letting Storm lead the way. The beach was quiet at this hour, the tide low and the waves lapping gently at the shore. Storm sniffed at the sand, his ears perking up with every sound. Keanu watched him closely, his heart racing with anticipation. Suddenly, Storm froze. His nose twitched furiously as he sniffed the air, and his body tensed as if he'd caught a familiar scent. Without warning, he let out a sharp bark and began pulling on the leash. "Whoa, whoa, easy, Storm," Keanu said, running to keep up as the dog bolted down the beach. Storm's barks grew louder and more urgent as he sprinted toward a cluster of rocks near the water's edge. Keanu followed, his boots sinking into the damp sand. When they rounded the rocks, Keanu stopped in his tracks. There, standing at the edge of the water, was a border collie. Her black and white coat glistened in the morning sun, and her ears perked up at the sound of Storm's barks. She turned her head, her eyes wide with recognition. "Annie," Keanu whispered, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. Storm broke free of the leash and raced toward her. Annie let out a series of sharp, excited barks and ran to meet him. The two collided in a flurry of wagging tails and joyful yips, their noses pressed together as if to confirm that this reunion was real. Keanu watched, his chest tightening with emotion. He could see the bond between the two dogs as they nuzzled each other. Annie licking Storm's face as if to reassure herself that he was truly there. The moment was almost too perfect, but it was made even more poignant when three smaller puppies emerged from behind Annie, their curious eyes fixed on Storm. Keanu knelt down, his voice gentle. "Is this your family, Storm?" Storm barked happily, his tail wagging so fast it blurred. The puppies bounded forward to greet their long-lost sibling, their tiny paws dancing in the sand as they playfully pounced on him. Annie stood back, her eyes full of gratitude as she looked at Keanu. She seemed to understand that this man had brought her son back to her, and she stepped forward, pressing her nose against his hand. "You're welcome," Keanu said softly, stroking her head. "He's a tough little guy, just like his mom." For the first time in days, Keanu felt a sense of completion. He had fulfilled his promise to Storm, reuniting him with his family. But as he watched them play together on the beach, a thought crossed his mind. What would happen next? The beach was alive with the sound of joy. Storm played with his siblings, his energy renewed as they tumbled and raced along the shoreline. Annie stayed close, her watchful eyes never leaving her reunited son. For the first time in weeks, the small family seemed whole again. Keanu stood a few steps back, smiling as he watched the heartwarming scene unfold. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment, but it was bittersweet. Storm had found his family, and Keanu knew that meant letting go. Annie approached him, her tail wagging gently as she pressed her nose into his hand again. Keanu crouched down, stroking her soft fur. "You've got a good boy there," he said quietly. "He's a fighter, just like you." Storm noticed and trotted over, nudging Keanu's arm with his nose. Keanu laughed and ruffled the fur on Storm's head. "Hey, buddy, looks like this is your happy ending." "Ha!" But as Keanu stood and looked at the playful family, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their journey together. Annie had a cautious look in her eyes, and though she was overjoyed to have Storm back, it was clear she and her puppies were living a hard life. He glanced at the beach, noticing a makeshift shelter tucked into the rocks, a place where Annie must have been staying to shield her puppies from the elements. Keanu's heart sank. "You've been out here on your own, haven't you?" he murmured, looking back at Annie. She tilted her head as if she understood, her tail wagging slowly. Keanu knelt again, looking into her eyes. "How would you and the little ones like to come with me? Somewhere warm and safe. I've got plenty of room, and I think Storm would like that too." Annie looked at him, then at her puppies, as if considering his offer. Storm barked once, wagging his tail as he pressed his body against Keanu's side. It was as if he were saying, "Come on, Mom, trust him." The decision didn't take long. Annie stepped closer, her tail wagging in agreement. Keanu smiled, relief washing over him. "All right then," he said, standing up. "Let's get you all out of here." Keanu led the family back to his truck, carrying the puppies in his arms while Annie and Storm followed close behind. He loaded them carefully into the back, making sure they were comfortable before climbing into the driver's seat. The drive back to Keanu's home was long but peaceful. Storm curled up beside his siblings, his body relaxed and content. Annie rested her head on the seat, her eyes half closed as she finally allowed herself to let go of the tension she had carried for so long. When they arrived, Keanu's home, a cozy house nestled in a quiet neighborhood, felt like a sanctuary. He opened the door and let the dogs explore, watching as their tails wagged with curiosity and excitement. "This is your home now," Keanu said, his voice filled with warmth. "You'll never have to worry about food, storms, or being alone again." Annie walked up to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. She licked his hand, and Keanu chuckled, scratching behind her ears. "You're welcome," he said softly. Storm ran back to Keanu, a toy clutched in his mouth that he had found among the scattered belongings in the house. He barked happily, dropping it at Keanu's feet as if to say, "Play with us." Keanu picked up the toy and tossed it across the room, laughing as Storm and his siblings scrambled after it. Annie watched from a nearby couch, her head resting on her paws as she finally relaxed, knowing her family was safe. The days that followed were filled with warmth and joy. Keanu made sure the family settled in comfortably, feeding them hearty meals and giving them the care they deserved. Storm became his shadow, following him everywhere, while Annie kept a watchful eye on the puppies as they explored their new surroundings. One evening, as the sun set behind the horizon, Keanu sat on the porch with Storm by his side. Annie and the other puppies lay sprawled out on the grass, enjoying the cool breeze. "You've all come a long way," Keanu said, looking down at Storm. "And so have I." Storm leaned against him, his amber eyes filled with love and trust. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right. Keanu knew he hadn't just saved Storm's life, Storm had changed his too. "No matter where life takes us, we'll always be a family," Keanu said softly, his hand resting gently on Storm's head. Storm wagged his tail, his amber eyes fixed on Keanu with a quiet understanding that only years of shared trust could bring. Annie let out a soft huff of contentment, curling into a comfortable position as the evening breeze rustled through the trees. As the stars above twinkled brightly, Keanu's mind wandered back to the day he had found Storm adrift on that piece of driftwood, barely clinging to life. He thought of the barnacles that had weighed him down, the storms that had battered him, and the long, difficult road to recovery. Now, here they all were, safe, loved, and together. Keanu let out a deep, satisfied sigh and leaned back in his chair, letting the peaceful sounds of the night surround him. The crickets chirped rhythmically, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze felt like nature's own lullaby. Inside, the puppies, now grown but still playful at heart, lay sprawled out across the living room, their steady breathing adding to the warmth of the home. Keanu glanced through the window, smiling at the sight of their peaceful slumber. As the night deepened, Keanu reached down to gently stroke Storm's fur one last time before standing. "Come on, buddy, let's call it a night." Storm followed him inside, his movements slower now with age but still filled with loyalty. Annie followed close behind, her steps steady and deliberate. Keanu made sure they were all settled, Storm in his favorite spot by the couch, Annie curled up near the fireplace, and the grown puppies scattered across their usual places. Before turning off the lights, Keanu paused to take in the scene. His heart swelled with gratitude. He had embarked on many journeys in his life, but this one, the journey that had brought Storm, Annie, and their family into his home, felt like the most meaningful of all. As Keanu climbed into bed that night, the house filled with the comforting presence of his adopted family. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. The storms they had all faced, literal and metaphorical, had led them to this moment. And together, they had weathered them all. In the quiet stillness of the night, Keanu whispered, "Good night, storm. Good night, Annie. Good night, everyone." And as the stars outside continued to shine, the little family slept soundly, bound together by love, resilience, and the unshakable bond they had forged through their shared journey.